Greetings everyone and welcome to today's webinar, part of Schulich School's webinar series on shaping the post-pandemic world. My name is Preet Aulad and I'm the Associate Dean of Research at Schulich. I'll be hosting the webinar and moderating the Q&A session. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, here is the agenda for today's webinar. We will start with brief introductions. This will be followed by the formal presentation from our panel of speakers led by Professor Eileen Fisher. Thereafter, we will take your questions. Please submit your questions anytime during the presentations and Q&A session. The session will end with some concluding remarks. Now it gives me great pleasure in introducing Professor Eileen Fisher. Dr. Fisher is a professor of marketing and the Tenenbaum Chair of Entrepreneurship and Family Enterprise at Schulich. She is also the director of the school's PhD program. During her illustrious academic career, Dr. Fisher has held various leadership positions in the broader profession, including editorships of internationally renowned journals at the Schulich School of Business and at the level of the university. Because of these sustained contributions, she was honored by York in 2016 with the title of University Professor. Dr. Fisher has made intellectual contributions in multiple areas, including consumer behavior, international business, qualitative methods, and entrepreneurship. Amongst these multiple areas of expertise, she's going to share her insights on one of them, and that's related to entrepreneurship. She has put together an exciting panel for today's webinar. I welcome Eileen to the webinar and request her to introduce the panel members and take over. To you, Eileen.
Thank you very much, Preet. I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm looking forward to talking to you about entrepreneurial resilience. When I was asked to participate in this webinar, I was thrilled because I really feel so passionately that entrepreneurship is super important to getting us through and out of this crisis. And I was tempted to take the entire time slot for myself, but that selfish motive gave way pretty quickly to realizing that I wanted to bring some fellow speakers on with me because in my travels, I've learned that there's a lot of wisdom around me here at Schulich. So this is what's going to happen during my seminar. I'm going to first introduce you to the panelists who will be joining me after my remarks. Then I'm going to talk about what entrepreneurial resilience means, give some lessons from the entrepreneurship literature, and then turn it over to my fellow panelists for theirs. Thoughts, and then we'll go to Q&A. So who have I invited? First, Chris Carter, who's an entrepreneur in residence at Schulich and the co-director currently of entrepreneurial studies. Next, Jeff Kistruck, he's the Ron Binns Chair in Entrepreneurship and the director of the social sector management program. Finally, Keith Liu, a very invaluable Schulich alum and advisor and mentor to scale-ups, keep goings, and etc. So without taking more time, I'm going to start going through my presentation. I want to begin with a definition of resilience. Resilience is a topic that could have been covered by, and indeed has been covered by many people in this seminar series so far, dating back as far as Dave Johnson's talk on resilience in the supply chain, or Winnie Chen's talk about organizational behaviors and leadership that will cultivate resilience in organizations, and going forward beyond my talk to the one that Ellen will be doing shortly on managing in these difficult times. So it's a pretty important topic overall, but I wanted to give an actual definition of it that refers to it being an ability to recover from or adjust to misfortune or change, which sure seems timely now. So what does our literature in entrepreneurship tell us about that? Well, one thing, and not unexpectedly, is it talks about some psychological determinants of entrepreneurial resilience. One is a bias or heuristic called overconfidence. Another is a trait or a learned characteristic called perceived self-efficacy. And a third is kind of an affect called persistent positive affect. But I'm not going to talk about those today because those are things that maybe you feel you can't learn or you can't do or can't acquire in the short run. And really what I wanted to focus on more is what the literature has to say about behavioral practices that are conducive to resilience. And I'm going to talk about 4, although I could have talked about a great many more, but I'm going to focus on pivoting, effectuation, collaboration, and getting guidance. So let's start with pivoting. Pivoting is a topic I was a little worried to bring up because I thought, well, we hear about pivoting in the popular press all the time, and anyone who's ever taken an entrepreneurship class has heard about it. But in thinking about it, I thought it was really important to bring it up for a couple of reasons. One is that I wanted to actually take us back to a definition of what pivoting means. And it is defined by Rees, who introduced the term, I think, as structured course correction of a business model. And that business model element of this is really important to realize. So it could mean changing your revenue model. It could mean changing your value chain. It could mean changing your segment of customers, or it could mean your product. So pivoting isn't necessarily about changing your entire business model. It can be about changing just one thing. Moreover, it can be born of necessity or opportunity. The key thing I really wanted to stress, and this from the literature in particular, is that pivots need to be pre-assessed. Despite how much popular talk there is about pivots, they're not all good, and they're not all good all the time. But when they make sense is when they're part of a method that entails testing ideas before making commitments to a new business model. Right now, we're seeing a lot of firms making deviations from their business models. For example, we're seeing lots of restaurants who are changing from in-house service, which they can't do anymore, to delivery or other kinds of variation on that. And those could definitely be defined as pivots, but they're not necessarily pivots that should be persistent. And so I think one of the things that we should learn from the literature is that when contemplating pivots for the long term, testing ideas before implementing them is a really important part of the overall zeitgeist of pivots, and bringing your stakeholders along with you is part of that. The second practice I want to talk about is something that has a rather jargonistic term, but I think that is super important. It's about using an effectual versus a causal approach to opportunity identification and enactment. And to give an illustration of this, I wanted to talk about a friend of mine who at the beginning of the COVID crisis was laid off by the gym that he worked for. And not unlike many of his peers, he went through a process that we can think of as a means-end process. What can I do with the means that are available? So if you begin on the left-hand side of this diagram, he asked himself, well, who do I know? What do I know? And what resources can I access? Well, he knew a lot of former clients or current clients. He also knew that he knew how to give training, and he knew that he had the means to do it remotely rather than in person, or at least he thought he did. He started calling around people like me to get feedback on the idea, and he started asking himself, okay, what can I do with the means available? And he quickly decided he was going to use Zoom to offer his sessions online. Then he went about seeking stakeholder commitments. He went through his Rolodex of people he knew and started saying, if I offered this, would you be willing to give me a try? Had that resulted in no commitment, it would have been an opportunity to be put on hold. But instead he found he had a willing and eager audience of people who were willing to pay for him to have sessions 1, 2, or 3 times a week. Now, this is something I think everybody's familiar with from friends of friends of friends. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there's actual science behind this, and this is called thinking through what you can do with the means available versus what resources do you need to achieve some final product, an effectual versus a causal logic. And there's a fascinating literature on this, and I've got lots of references to share with you after the seminar is over if you're interested. Third practice I want to talk about, though, moving along and keeping this running, is collaboration with peers and customers. Often when we think of entrepreneurship, we think of the myth of the great individual, and I should say often it's the great man. And there's an enduring, persistent image of people going it alone with entrepreneurship. Sorry, my slides are getting away from me there. But that isn't always necessarily the way entrepreneurship works. And in some recent research that I was fortunate enough to co-author with Andre Maciel, we've been looking at basically entrepreneurship through collaboration with peers. The research that we just published is on the craft beer industry, and it's been really interesting to compare what small independent craft brewers have done versus what large independent entrepreneurs do. So we looked at the mindset they have, which is not a zero-sum game, but a rising tide floats all boats. We recognized that none of them individually, no craft brewer, had the opportunity to create and seize the opportunity on their own, but collectively they could do a lot. What was really interesting to us was the way they collaborated. And in the study that we just published, we looked at several consistent and pervasive forms of collaboration with peers, from lending resources to one another, to providing knowledge to one another, to joining together to lobby for what they needed. Really interesting in this research is the extensive role that was played by trade associations, which were formed by, you know, some of the leaders in the craft beer coalition. And finally, what was really, really super interesting was how much was contributed in the craft beer movement by allies, consumer allies, who helped create recipes, volunteer to lobby politicians, and served as activists that basically got that industry off the ground. I think going forward, we're going to have to see a lot of collaborations that cross the boundaries of peer firms, trade associations, and consumers. The final practice I want to talk about is getting guidance, especially during times of economic challenge. The research shows us that those, especially those starting their first business, but even those on their second, third, or fourth, are probably going to benefit from sharing, from getting feedback on what they're doing. Contrary to much popular myth, an investment in business on education really has been shown time and time and again in the literature to pay off. It really does lead to more successful businesses in the long run. In addition, peer mentoring from fellow entrepreneurs, hugely, hugely helpful in ensuring that those first businesses that are launched in challenging times actually survive and thrive. And finally, coaching from those with industry experience. And while you might think, well, this is just a promotional plug for taking courses or whatever, it's not. It's actually really super interesting to see what the research has to say on the benefits of getting guidance. And with that, I'm going to end my presentation and throw it over to Chris Carter. I asked each of the individual panelists to join me today because through my knowledge of them or my conversations with them, I knew they'd have something to add. And Chris is going to join us first. Chris, as I mentioned, is our entrepreneur in res at Schulich and a co-director of entrepreneurial studies. And he's also just somebody who's been really central in figuring out entrepreneurial ecosystems and how to take advantage of them and make them better. Chris, I'm looking really forward to seeing what you have to say.
Thanks, Eileen, and great job in kicking us off. I really appreciate being included here today with the other guests. And I'm going to build on some of the things that you set the table on for us here and talk about how have those things translated into the Canadian ecosystem and how we've responded. Have our assets and our attitudes been resilient and ready to take this on? And then report into everyone on how the Schulich entrepreneurial ecosystem has responded through the crisis. Okay, so just looking through, some of the key issues here. First, I want to start off with the assets. I think the important thing to understand about the current battle versus the battle that we faced in the past with different situations, with the dot-com collapse, with what happened with the business community through 9/11, or even the March 2008 collapse that we faced in the economy. What's different this time around? Well, first and foremost, one, we have 3 epic storms under our belts as a community this time. And this has clearly led to a plethora of understandings and key things that we can leverage this time around that didn't exist before. I lived through both of those, all 3 of those situations with my core business and watched what was or wasn't available. It's a different situation and we're quite well prepared. We have a collective playbook and it's been quickly shared across the ecosystem through a natural set of communication channels. And we also have a clear set of leaders within the ecosystem, a couple of which I'm going to talk to you about as we go along, that have been particularly impressive in terms of how they rallied everybody, that have stood up and talked to everyone about what we need to do very quickly within 48 hours of entering the situation. We also have established B2B digital networks and communities to leverage that didn't exist in the past crises related to the schools and the academic institutions, what they've set up, the key accelerators and incubators. And we also have a universal understanding now of the pivot, as Eileen pointed out, and the different iterations and variations of that. We also have a huge ecosystem of key API-ready platforms ready to help us to rapidly accelerate these digital iterations that are taking place. So we don't have to build everything from scratch. We can plug in and figure out how we can iterate in partnership with different players in the ecosystem. So I think we've also been ready to be key players in the COVID-19 fight itself. And this is different from the past, where the startup community and the entrepreneurial community is being looked to help address the key issue as it relates to health and security and food. We are really at the point where we are now key agents in this remote digital world and ready to take on this problem. But there are some big questions and some potential challenges we can talk about later related to how much time do we have, and are we well prepared for a long fight or a short fight as a community? Do we have the right access to capital? And have we spent the right time predicting the new normals, and how do we extract new value for our customers and consumers? And lastly, have we established the right voice with government as we've gone along? There's been some amazing leaders here that we've seen emerge, and I'm going to highlight just a couple of them. The work that Bryce Seshuk, the co-founder of Win Mobile and the co-founder of Global Live Capital, has done has been fantastic. Coming out, speaking up, getting engaged with all the different online and digital communities. And when you look at key things that you should be reading as you go forward, after the event, we'll share his notes that he's been compiling of all of his lessons learned and all the conversations he's been having with people across the ecosystem, and everyone from Techstars to the Upside Foundation and other leaders have done a fantastic job. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is our attitudes correct? Have we been ready collectively to tackle this situation? I think one, we've been ready collectively to support each other. We were ready to stand and fight and take action and to embrace real creative fearlessness. So, you know, having the ability to not just pivot, but to completely reimagine the business on the fly and realize that in certain circumstances, it needs to be torn down and started over on the fly. And there's some great examples of that happening already. For the first time, we've been openly ready to discuss mental health as a key issue as it relates to entering a crisis as an entrepreneur. And I think everyone's had an attitude ready to listen to mentors and investors and advisors as well, and view this, most importantly, as a huge opportunity. You know, it's right that not every business is going to survive this, and there's going to be huge problems and huge issues for people to handle. But as a starting point, the businesses that have jumped out of the gate, realizing that there was a big opportunity here to tackle that, when everybody is slowed down, potentially you can move forward and leapfrog your competition, have started to move quickly and aggressively to take a really strong future place. And people have also understood right away that they needed to keep their eyes wide open, immediately talk to their customers, immediately talk to their clients. As Eileen said, be open to co-creation and people who wanted to see them survive and wanted to join that future possibility. Here's a couple quick examples for you of Schulich entrepreneurs that are in the ecosystem that are doing great things. This is a company called ShipSwift, and a deal is a Schulich BBA from 2015. He launched his business in January, and not only did he, you know, continue to build it, when he launched it, he was working full-time at Amazon. He actually quit his job at Amazon in an extremely secure position about 4.5 weeks ago now, and came in full-time to work on his business. And it's grown during that period of time exponentially. It's gone from $3,000 a month in MRR to 10 to 20, and I'm sure soon it's going to hit the 100K mark by the time we get through the end of the summer. And you can see just some of his attitudes and approaches to this have really been looking at, like Eileen talked about, how do we like reach out and collaborate with people? How do we get support? How do we get information? Where he's gone out and reached out to all kinds of different mentors and founders and partners to get that done. And even another example of here where one deal fell through, and he took the work done on that deal, applied it to a new deal, and then was able to move faster into his next opportunity. We've got companies like Blade Filters who have seen this as an opportunity to build a COVID-19 related product set. So Giancarlo and Aiden, both Schulich alumni, have started creating filters. Originally, these filters are for the cannabis space, but as that business has not dwindled, but just slowed down just a bit, they've taken some of their extra time, and they've actually started to start building COVID-19 related air filtration systems and have opened a whole new category of possibility. Richa Gupta from Good Food for Good also has let us know that her business has not slowed down. She views it in a different way. And this is where, you know, some of the businesses are just going to, like, you know, not have as much, fast rising opportunity right now. However, they're going to have to look for different approaches. So here's an example where partnering up with an existing digital platform that wouldn't have been possible in the past just 5 years ago. Now Sampler is available to do digital sampling for a product, whereas before she might have been standing with her team in a grocery store, actually giving people samples or finding other ways to take it direct into community fairs or different community events. We've also had students that have stepped up and actually created COVID-19 related innovations. And these were 3 that we recently featured. The one I'll highlight here for a moment is Grocery Hero with Luca. And he was able to go out within a matter of 48 hours and bring together a platform with a group of friends to help people begin to deliver groceries for frontline care workers all throughout the country. And right now, at last count, he had something like 6,000 people were signed up in Canada to help deliver groceries to the frontline care workers. So we've also had our Schulich alumni and students jump in to help out with new businesses and new opportunities. What have we done? What has the school done? And what has the Entrepreneurial Studies Group done to tackle things? Well, we've moved. You can see here, we used to all meet and get together in person. We just shifted that right away to the online iteration of that in terms of how we got together and supported each other. We quickly brought in a group of different leading experts. We had Bryce come in, we had Aaron Burry from Willful. We have another event coming up with Cherry Rose Tan talking about mental health, one of our Schulich entrepreneurship instructors, and got our companies and our students direct access to people who could help them solve their problems. In Bryce's session here, it was a 3-hour session where he spent late into the night answering individual founders' queries and problems that they were dealing with. Working with Vito, who's the head of our Schulich Entrepreneurial Alumni Association, we quickly put together the Zoom version of the Idea Jam and brought together 3 COVID-19 centric initiatives. 50 founders came out, 135 participants into the Zoom chat, and together generated more than 100 ideas, contacts, and creative perspectives for those 3 companies on how they could build and how they could move forward. So we've seen our community rally around the startups within the alumni and student base to help them out as well too. We went a little bit further and said, now we're going to start to work to help the external business community as well. So we launched, along with Schulich entrepreneurship instructor Stuart Brown, the Schulich PICAP COVID-19 Business Support Center. And that support center hired 15 students. And those students are working with small businesses all throughout the GTA and Ontario to help them to figure out how to quickly assess their grant eligibility, how to apply their grants, and how to look at pivots and new opportunities for their companies. And it's all being done remotely, and put 15 super talented Schulich recent graduates and students to work. Yesterday, we also announced the formation of a new project along with the City of Toronto and a leading group of global technology companies, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, eBay, MasterCard, a whole set of interesting organizations all come together under the announcement of Mayor John Tory here in Toronto to let everyone know that we would be now collectively working to help small businesses in the Main Street retail category, the restaurants, the artists, and the small retailers on Main Street, bring all of their business online into the digital environment. And as part of that, we have created 50 paid placements for Schulich students who are now working as digital and project leaders, helping bring those companies online. And lastly, we knew that we wanted to do some work to help within the startup space, both to bring new talent for our startup companies, but to create some opportunities for the Schulich students in India from our Hyderabad campus, and working with professors Ashwin Joshi and Theo Paridis. And we put together this internship program. So here you're seeing a group of all of the Schulich startup companies or Schulich affiliated companies who stepped up and have taken an intern from the India cohort, and they're now working remotely on all sorts of interesting projects for these startups here in Toronto. 28 of those matches made. So those are some of the things we've been up to. That's what's happening within our ecosystem. That's how I'm seeing and observing how the larger ecosystem is performing and how the Schulich startups are working through all this. All 140 of them that we work with that are Schulich founded or student companies. And lastly, I would just leave you with a thought that we've gone through a period where there's been an intense period of energy and activity around rallying our businesses and our entrepreneurs. And now collectively, we need to find a new rhythm that is for the long haul, because there's going to be a transformation in so many social and business and economic spaces that these businesses have to be able to sustain for a longer period of time. So thank you for that. And I will pass it back over to Eileen.
Thank you so much, Chris. I really enjoyed hearing what you had to say. You knew you had a lot to tell us, and I'm proud to be part of the coalition that you've built there. I'm really also very proud to introduce my colleague, Jeff Kistruck. Jeff, I particularly wanted to ask to contribute to this session because Jeff has, for his entire career as an academic, been really focused on entrepreneurship under conditions of extreme adversity. Jeff, I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you to Eileen for the introduction. In the interest of time, I'll try and move as fast as I can. My name is Jeff Kistruck. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at Schulich. And despite what it says on the slide right now, my middle name is not Danger. However, that is a cute nickname that students often give to me because as opposed to studying entrepreneurship in traditional sorts of settings, for the last 15 years, I've been looking at how entrepreneurs engage and deal with crises in places like Ethiopia, El Salvador, Nepal, these sort of places where, again, there's some sort of either military, political, economic crisis that's sort of a day-to-day adventure. So as part of that, I wanted to share with you just some brief lessons about sort of what we've put together to help them as they address with these sorts of daily issues. First thing I wanted to, sorry, just making the screen move. There we go. First thing I want to do is in some ways deconstruct the definition that Eileen gave. In Eileen's definition, it talked about resilience either being sort of maintaining or going back to or creating something new. The way that we see entrepreneurial resilience as being different from resilience is exactly along that dimension. That number one, resilience is often thought of as sort of maintaining, as it says there, reliable functioning. And this other ways of sort of like trying to stay normal to what you were before. The idea of entrepreneurial resilience is very much more about adapting to threatening circumstances in ways that are creating a new normal. And as a result of that as well, when we talk about entrepreneurial resilience, as Eileen talked about briefly, a lot of the tendency is to start going towards either psychological traits, the extent to which your previous lifestyle or living through prior pandemics or something of that nature has created a new sense of perseverance or self-efficacy. Alternatively, people talk about organizational models of redundancy, having supply chains that have multiple suppliers that if one were to fall apart, then you could take care of things. Network configurations, very much about how can you structure your set of ties, both professionally and personally, to make sure that you have access to diverse sets of information and resources. Much like what Eileen said, if you've already done this, you can tune out for the next 7 minutes. This is the sort of thing, though, that a lot of people, when a pandemic hits, they don't have these things in place. They are frightened about what's happening right now. Their model in their organization or business was not structured to withstand something like this. And while they try and make sense of their network ties, a lot of people they reach out to are in the same space that they are. So what I want to focus on is talking about entrepreneurial resilience, not so much as a mindset and organizational models and network configuration, but as a process. And the process that we refer to is something called ABLE. And I'm going to be very descriptive and prescriptive in sort of my summaries here. So by ABLE, and this is something we've developed and worked with in entrepreneurs in these other countries, we talk about a basic process of ask, build, experiment, learn, and looping back afterwards. So ask, build, experiment, learn, and the loop back is very much what both Chris and Eileen were talking about, a pivot. So I'm going to try and also contextualize some of the things that they were talking. But as I do that and recognizing that a lot of my own expertise sort of emerges from places like Nepal or Ethiopia, I decided to reach out to my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law runs a trucking company here in Ontario. And has for about the last 6 years since my father-in-law died. And so he took it over at that point in time, which again was another crisis. But what's happened basically is they have 7 trucks and they deliver steel. They're not large and they have drivers that they use and they deliver steels to construction site. Well, he was not deemed one of the essential businesses when the Ontario government shut everybody down. So for a chunk of time there, they went with absolutely zero revenue, trying to make decisions around how to manage their employees and what to do. Now, in the last sort of, he started up again about 2 weeks ago. And at that point in time, his revenue has come back a little bit, but he is not only worried that it's going to be low for several months, but that it's potentially even longer after that. So he's sort of thinking, again, much like I think maybe a lot of people on this call right now, how do I survive this? And I walked through the ABLE process with him to sort of disentangle some of the things that he's done that maybe fall into this as good examples. So number one, let me talk about step one is ask. And when we talk about ask, Eileen said something about a means-ends relationship. And that's really important. And the reason for that is very often when people try to think about what they should do with their business, they start thinking about what is it that the customer wants? What is it that's happening in the world that are a shift in demand? What are the different sort of traits of shifts in political, technological, social trends that might be making some more difference? And we don't suggest sort of looking to those typical sort of signals when you're looking at engaging in times of crisis for a couple of reasons. Number one, they're very confusing. Often a lot of people are unable to sort of explain what they want right now, or they talk about many different things. And number two, if anything, they're contracting. And what I mean by contracting is your customers are demanding more of what you offered before for less money. That's not good business for you. You're already struggling with low margins, your revenues are down, and you need to find a different way of doing this. So the process of ABLE starts with looking at your means, very similar to the effectuation that Eileen was talking about here. And it talks about basically saying, how can I use my existing set of resources and redeploy them in new ways? And that's really important for two reasons. Number one, this pivot process can really get hung up. If at the end of the day, you've come up with a great idea based on speaking to the world and reading a whole bunch of websites, and at the end of the day, you don't have the resources to be able to pull that off. You've just wasted your time. So it helps streamline that process. But number two, it helps filter out the noise from what people are talking about through these market signals. So the example I'm going to flow through here very quickly, my brother-in-law, again, speaking to him, asking, what did you think about when all of a sudden you couldn't get the trucks on the road? He said, well, when I first took over the company years ago, there was a productivity problem. I didn't know where the drivers were. I didn't know where the trailers were. I had to pick up the phone and call them. And if they were at a truck stop eating something or whatever it is, I was really hung up. So I set up a simple phone system of doing these things. And he said, over the past couple of years, I've actually kept making little improvements to it. And he started thinking when sort of, the crap hit the fan here, could other trucking companies use something similar to this? And is there something I could do with this sort of asset, which is not my core business normally, but something that maybe I can do to sort of improve things? Which goes to the second step, which is build. And by build, we probably heard the term before, prototype, or this other thing that we call a minimum viable product or minimum viable process. And really what the key is to this is don't try and conduct a lot of research beforehand. Don't waste your time on trying to figure out the perfect sort of product or service offering you could give to somebody, but literally go around there and say, with the resources I have at hand, what is the absolute minimum that I can put together for a small number of individuals that can actually let me know if this is something that's feasible or deserves further attention or not. And again, it could be a new product, it could be a new service, but as Eileen was also saying, it could just be reimagining sort of what you had before, a new business model way of doing what you had, or again, a reconfiguration of your value chain. Maybe you realize you can't afford to outsource certain things to people before, and maybe you have the capabilities in-house to do that. So again, in my brother-in-law's case here, his example was saying, I was able to take this rough system in 5 days and $200, which he paid for a web app sort of download, and put together this truck tracking thing. He doesn't even have a name for it yet. I kept asking him for a name. Doesn't have a name for it. It's this truck tracking thing to see what he can do here. But it was a web-based app that he was able to build on his own. He was an architect earlier on in his life, so he was able to leverage that as a resource as well and put something together. Which goes to step 3, which is experiment. And by experiment, we're talking about, again, seek out in your network, even 5 people, 10 people, whatever you can find that hopefully are potential consumers of this product or service, and get them to try it. But before doing that, it's really important to develop a set of hypotheses. And I know this sounds nerdy and scientific for a second, but trust me, it's important. You need to sort of idealize what is it that would be the positive outcomes you would expect from whatever your MVP is. And even just as importantly, what are the negatives or the downsides? Obviously, you think the positives are going to outweigh the negatives, or else you wouldn't give it a shot. But you need to make a track of both of those. And even most importantly, make up your reasons why. Identify the rationale and the reason behind you think, well, this is going to be connection between the outcomes that you observe and the thing that you're putting in place. And then you launch it. And again, what happened here, my brother-in-law reached out to what are called truck brokers, which are sort of third-party people that'll run a load for you. And he said, look, you guys are always looking for loads. I'll let you do a couple jobs on the side for this one customer that we have if you agree to use this app for 1 week. And then finally here, a step 4 is to learn. And again, by learn, it's a super important part here. I don't know if you guys have sort of read up on this sort of literature, but this notion of failure as a learning opportunity, that is not just garbage. That is not just made up speak. It truly is how we grow our sort of cognitive patterns in our head and how these things happen. So when you do this and you look through your feedback, be very careful not to just cherry pick what seem to be successful stories or things that seem to work and latch onto those more than the comprehensive set of information. Identify your biases, understand that this was a pet project of yours going in, that you want it to work, and look at things a lot more critically. And again, in the example of my brother-in-law here, he had assumed they had a motivation to sort of use his system properly. So the system involves on your phone sort of tapping a 1, a 2, or a 3, which is a code to start something before you go in. Well, the brokers didn't really care enough. They hit a button as they were driving. It could be a 4, could be a 1. And so the whole system fell into place and all the things that he got was absolutely useless. So the last thing, my last slide is just talking about and repeat. So in my brother-in-law's case, what he's done now is switch to a drop-down box so they can't mess up with their thumbs anymore on the phone. And that's a really small example, but this notion of sort of ask, build, experiment, learn, looping back, making modifications. This is the pivot deconstructed here. Ask, build, experiment, learn again. We're hoping will not only sort of help you get through this current pandemic, but will develop new heuristics, routines in both your own mind and that of your organization, such that when these crises hit again, you're better prepared to handle them. And that's all I had to say. Turn it back over to Eileen.
Great, thank you so much, Jeff. That was fantastic. And last, I want to introduce Keith Liu, and I want to explain that I asked Keith because, for one thing, Keith is one of our treasured alumni, and for another reason, I've seen him interact with entrepreneurs in many settings, and he is super impressive in terms of his ability to listen, his ability to synthesize information, and his ability to give amazing advice. I asked Keith, did he have some examples of things that were impressing him during this time of crisis, and he said he had, so I'm all ears, Keith. I'm looking forward to hearing it.
Thank you. Maybe for some context, for those of you who don't know me, I advise startups, scale-ups, and keep goings, as I say, or businesses in general. And where it came from was I was a co-founder of CTO Boost, which was Canada's first fractional CTO service. Essentially, when a company raised their first $5, $10, or $50 million, and they promised their investors they're going to build the best thing since sliced bread, but they couldn't deliver, well, the investors called us, and we would step in as the new leaders of the company and help them get where they need to go. And in that timeline, we were able to build some of Canada's more successful startups, but also worked with most of our banks, telcos, and retailers across North America. And and our company slogan was, we solve big effing problems. But essentially, now is that time, isn't it? After I exited that company, I just started focusing on helping startups and scale-ups that I really believed in. And so when I was talking to Eileen, she asked, hey, what examples do you have of companies that are not just surviving, but are thriving during the pandemic? And I certainly have a few examples. I've probably worked with over 100 entrepreneurs in the past 2 months or so. And I don't want to paint everything with rose-colored glasses. Not everyone's doing well. There are companies that have had to close and didn't really have the opportunity to change their business in time. But there are certainly quite a few that have been doing quite well. And so I wanted to share some of those examples with you. I'll try to share the details that I can share, and I've asked the founders if I could do so. The first is a company called TimeSaved, which I was an early investor in, an advisor, and now a fractional executive at. But TimeSaved is a staffing technology software. Sounds boring, but is amazing technology. And essentially they help staffing companies make their business a lot more efficient. Now, the majority of their business was focused on light industrial. Think about a lot of people who work in factories. If you had a factory and you needed to hire 100 people next week, well, this company would provide you with technology to make sure that you can do it really quickly. Now, if you think about what happened in the pandemic, well, people aren't working in factories right now. And so that's become a challenge, and the company thought, hey, what can we do? Well, we knew that we invested into taking our same platform and putting it into healthcare. And we actually started going to market with that late last year, I think around December. And so we thought, hey, why don't we ramp up on our go-to-market with healthcare? Because clearly the industry needs help with healthcare healthcare staffing in particular. And so we did that. And in March, we started landing our first, actually earlier this year, we started landing our first few clients. But the success story is we started working with this one staffing company who is about a 16 or $20 million business. And they lost the majority of their business. And so we started working with them with software that would help deploy their employees faster into hospitals. And since then, they have more than doubled their healthcare business. And now they're expecting to be a $40 million business by the end of this year by using our technology. And so that was an example of a company, TimeSave, that's pivoting our sector, who we're focusing on. We used to focus on light industrial, and that will come back. But healthcare clearly needs our help right now. And with some changes, we're seeing some success. And I'd say in the past 6 weeks, our phone has been going crazy, and we're in over 8 hospitals in the US. And the one thing we want to do was, hey, what can we do to help Canada? And we actually built a version of our software to offer to Canadians for free. We actually reached out to every premier and most of the major hospitals and say, hey, why don't you use our software? We sell it in the US, but in Canada, we're gonna give it to us for free. And we wanna really help hospitals deploy nurses, doctors, but also janitors faster because people are getting sick. But that's an example of a York-related startup that is doing well. Another one is a Schulich startup co-founded by Schulich students or Schulich alumni. And it's called Endev Studios. At first, it was in the past couple of years, we've been building a game. And we were building a AAA title. We invested a lot of money into building an amazing game. And we believe that this game is going to be phenomenal. Now, the challenge that we have is building massive titles take a long time, and it's heavy in R&D. And while the pandemic hit, not only did that hurt our funding, but we actually had to lay off some people with that company. And now we have to look at, hey, how do we stay alive? How do we thrive through this environment? And so we looked at, what we had as assets. And while the core asset that we have is a team of really bright developers, architects, and data people. And so we reached out to the community and said, hey, how can we all work together? We have talent, other people are hurting. Why can't we work together? And so during this time, we've actually started working with other technology startups and providing them with technology expertise. And actually what's been, we've been solely a product company has turned into now a services company that is still building a product. And so we're generating revenue that's helping build our product while helping other startups. And so, we've heard a lot about, collectiveness and collaboration through our talk today. And trust me, we're seeing a lot of that. A lot of the entrepreneurial community is working together. What resources can we share? Maybe I can be your customer, I can be your partner, and we can help each other out. And that's really been showing through. And that's been quite exciting for Endev Studios. The third startup I want to give an example of, and this one I have to do confidentially, so I can't mention the company name. But this company is a early stage startup that has seen a lot of success. It's actually a very celebrated Schulich student startup that has been doing quite well. It's been winning all kinds of competitions. And again, it's a product focused company that has been building its product for the past year, invested quite a bit of money on it. But then they saw the opportunity and said, hey, look, right now our product can still go and might need another year to get there. But instead, what does the current environment really need? And we really need assistance with relationships, especially with all the social distancing and working remotely. How do we help the relationships and build those relationships? And so what the company did was a complete pivot, build a new product that is unrelated to what they originally did and really focused on this. And what we're seeing is on initial testing, huge demand and there's a huge demand for the actual product. And so we should probably be going live probably by June, and it should be quite exciting. We'll probably announce it and hopefully you'll hear all about it. But that's an example of a company that did a 180 complete change in terms of what they're doing. And the last example, and I thought this one would probably be a good example because not all companies are just startups or starting. This one's a scale up. We're talking a very, very big company. And they've been doing their business for quite a few years now, have tremendous technology, really strong IP, and is seen as a leader in terms of the type of technology that they have. Their challenge is that they're in one of the industries, travel, that has been hit the hardest, right? As you can imagine, all of their clients are seeing, well, no revenue, and therefore themselves, they're struggling with that. And so we went back and said, what can we do? Can we continue selling our product into an industry that is not going to be paying us anytime soon? But what we did was we actually found, the reason this technology and this product is successful is because we're able to help transform other travel agencies so that they become more efficient, so they can save money, so that they can be more efficient. And if you think about it, when we come back post-COVID, post-pandemic, the airline industry is going to resume. However, they're probably going to be a little tighter on their spend. And so if we can help them become more efficient, which is precisely what we do, we can probably be successful and come out on the other side. And so what we've done is double down on what we need to do, but be laser focused on helping our end clients transform and helping them to save money. And since that time, we have probably landed the largest and most impactful contracts within the industry since. And so this is, 4 examples of 4 different sizes and 4 different types of companies. But the one thing I wanted to bring it all together was that, right now everyone is looking at how can we work together, how can we get good guidance, and how do we talk with other entrepreneurs so we can learn from each other. And I can say it's been an exciting time, and I feel very privileged to participate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. I think it's time for us to turn ourselves over to Q&A for just a few minutes that we have left. And I believe Preet is going to guide us through that.
Okay, thanks everyone for a very informative session. So we have time for just a few questions. So I want to start with Gwen Pinto de Mello, who basically wants to know how different is entrepreneurship in Canada, globally, and in emerging markets. And I would like to add to that is that given the pandemic, do you see different responses to the pandemic depending on where you are from?
I'm going to start, but I think this might be one we all want to chime in on. I think that one thing that's very commendable about Canada as a place to start up business, and the research is very clear on this, is it's pretty easy to get a business up and running in Canada. That's not necessarily true in every jurisdiction. I think during COVID times, we've also seen a considerable amount of support for small and medium-sized enterprises. That is true in some other jurisdictions, but not necessarily here. Those are the 2 top of mind things for me. I'm going to throw it over to the other panelists to see what they'd like to add.
I'll jump in for 1 second. It's Jeff Kistruck. One of the biggest sort of delineation points between it traditionally is that very often entrepreneurship in places like Canada is what we refer to as opportunity entrepreneurship. Whereas places in emerging markets are very much what we refer to as necessity entrepreneurship. In other words, in Canada, we make choices to say, I want to quit my opportunity for a full-time job, or I would rather pursue that. Whereas lots of entrepreneurs in places where I do research anyways, they don't have a choice. There is no job opportunity out there. And the comment I wanted to make is actually talking to a colleague yesterday, and these worlds are beginning to merge now. And in fact, my colleague is starting a study on necessity entrepreneurship in Alberta. Because this is one of those cases now where they expect unemployment rate because of the oil industry to get as high as 25, 30%. And as a result of that, how is it that what we tend to be as people that again are making these choices are going to have to be thrown? What are the ecosystems that are required for a necessity entrepreneur who didn't necessarily want to do this in the first place, but rather has to do it as a result of that? I think those are different sets of sort of instructional activities. I think it's a different set of sort of ecosystem and government supports that's going to be required.
Okay, I think the next question is related to what I think Eileen mentioned in her talk about the association with the gender-based association of entrepreneurship. So there's a question from Dirk Matten. And his question is, we learn these days that countries led by female leaders have succeeded somewhat better to address this crisis. Is there a gender dimension in entrepreneurial efforts to deal with C-19 crisis? Are similar hopes currently pinned on female leaders in politics warranted to be projected to female leadership in entrepreneurship?
Well, thanks, Dirk. That is a really good question, and I think it's a little early to tell the answer to it yet. One thing I will point out, as many commentators have, is that this is often being referred to now as a she-cession, not a recession, because a disproportionate effect of the pandemic has been on women in the service sector. We certainly need to acknowledge just how tough it is for those women who have all of a sudden been thrown out of work. But I also want to say that I think that Jeff spoke of necessity type businesses. We will see women leading many necessity-based businesses. And lest we think of those as lesser businesses, those are the backbone of our economy. So let's not knock them. As to whether female leadership will rise to this occasion, I mean, there's a very complex knot of issues that need to be taken into account when we think about female entrepreneurship. One of which is differences in communication style. I was just reading a paper yesterday that talked about how differently women communicate about their ideas, tending to use less aggrandizing terms, less inspirational rhetoric, and it tends to not serve them well in settings where people are out there pitching for resources. So I think we do expect a lot of female leaders, but there are some entrenched issues that we still all need to collectively identify to overcome to let the full power of female entrepreneurship be revealed.
And just to build on that, Eileen, I think that one of the areas where this is really going to test is in relation to access to capital, as it relates to the venture community and the angel community. And women entrepreneurs were also already facing an uphill disadvantaged battle in terms of accessing capital, as the numbers show. There's been a lot of work that's been done on that from government and the VC community in Canada in the last, year and a half. It started to really come into focus. There's also been a lot of work that's been done on diversity funds as well too. But I think this is going to be, a challenging time to see whether that kind of like progressive, forward-thinking capital continues to flow, or whether if there's just less capital in general, whether it will go back into traditional, targets and targets that are just all about the money and all about the deal and not about thinking and all about what people feel, the men who often control elements of the venture capital community feel comfortable with in terms of lending, and not challenging themselves to think bigger and wider in terms of these types of leadership. The second point I would add to that is that where anecdotally from within our own community and from within like the extended startup community, one area where I saw tremendous advantage and leadership within the opening 5 to 10 days was the women leading their companies that I observed had a much more, a much more thoughtful and open and caring approach to the emotional, to the mental health side, and to the impact of everybody going home, the impact of people being under threat of their jobs and wondering what was taking place. And I saw women such as Erin Bury from Willful, as just one example within the community, stepping up and really like showing how to lead a team and how to like think about caring for people as a family. So I think that was like a tremendous thing that many of the men entrepreneurs could look to and learn from in terms of how some of our most fantastic women leaders embrace the crisis and how to tackle it with their staff and their people in a more reflective way.
Actually, I just want to add on to what you're saying there, Chris. Actually, 3 of the 4 examples that I just gave are women-led companies. And, the one thing that we're seeing in common is exactly what you're talking about, is that, I don't know if it's emotional support, but it's that support of the company, support of the people, ensuring that voices are heard, but also making sure that we continue building that social, I don't want to call it social network, but that social fabric for the entire company, ensuring that each person is still doing well. And that's something that we're seeing in a lot of these companies that are thriving.
We are out of time, but we'll just go through 2 quick questions. There's one from Deb Meek. The question is there a difference in your mind between an entrepreneur and a self-employed?
I can take that, yes. This is, again, maybe building off the last question, but an entrepreneur is very much thought of as somebody who is innovative. In fact, that's why when we talk about entrepreneurship, it's not necessarily about being a single individual. You can be you can be an entrepreneur as a corporation. There's a whole bunch of things. So self-employed is very much more about a sole proprietor, somebody who engages in businesses. But certainly where I do a lot of my research, those businesses are largely copycats of what somebody else is doing. You've got 18 coffee shops in a small village. Though I wouldn't label those individuals entrepreneurs, I would label those individuals self-employed. And again, I think it's the innovation piece, which is the key sort of differentiating factor.
So we'll finish up with the last question. This is from Ashwin Joshi. And the question is, what is the role of government in enabling the resilience shown by the gym instructor, which was Eileen's example, and the trucking company, Jeff's example?
Well, I'll start. I mean, I think I mentioned this in my response to an earlier question. I think one of the big roles that the Canadian government plays is making it easy for small businesses to start up, like really cutting down the red tape. The second thing is in the current climate, I think they've tried to do an enormous array of things that will help to sustain businesses that are struggling during these periods of time. And I celebrate all levels of government in the Canadian ecosystem for having really risen to the occasion. And not everything they've done is perfect, but they've really, I think, identified the entrepreneurial sector as one that's important to support. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that.
I would just to build on that, I agree. I think, at all levels, they've done a well-intentioned job and have really created some great programs. So definitely hats off to everybody in that regard. I think the one reflection we need to take away from a government perspective on this crisis, if we're to be ready for the next one, is that the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Canada has not done the best job of speaking with a collective voice to government. So unlike what we might have reached in terms of maturity of government relationship and connection in Washington with American technology entrepreneurs, we haven't really had that in Canada. That maturity hasn't evolved of actually making sure that our voice is clear, heard. And so what happened when the crisis started to unfold is that there were a dozen, 100 fractured voices that have different forms of relationship and interest with the government. And they all went after different topics or key programs or key perspectives. Big tech, small startups, accelerator only, companies that were, global versus local, unicorns, narwhals, not. And so the government had to deal with like a just massive onslaught of voice coming at them. And so I think that's where you've seen sometimes with the entrepreneurial programs, they've struggled to understand the nuances related to how to activate and actualize these programs in a rapid fashion. So we can't just blame that on government. We have to take responsibility for ourselves as an ecosystem to be better prepared for the next crisis so that we have the vehicles and the organizations and collective organization to respond properly.
So I think we'll end here. So I wish to thank all our panelists for the stimulating session and to the audience for joining us and for your questions. So in closing, I just want to mention our next webinar, which is on Thursday, where Professor Irene Henriquez is going to talk about the economic impact of a pandemic. And so hope to see most of you for that session. And finally, I want to reiterate that if you have any questions regarding the webinar series or admissions or our programs, please feel free to join us through these websites or through various social media platforms. And so with this, I will say goodbye and hope to have most of you back in the next webinar. Thank you.